There's a particular exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you've done today, and everything to do with how much of it was actually you. You can sleep 8 hours, eat well, take the day off, and still feel a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of rest seems to touch. Most people assume this is burnout. It rarely is. Burnout comes from doing too much. This comes from being too much of someone you had to construct. And the strange, quiet truth almost nobody tells you is that the exhaustion doesn't lift when the performing stops. Something else happens first. Something far more disorienting than relief. This isn't a video about authenticity in the way that word gets thrown around online. It's about a specific psychological threshold, the moment a person stops managing how they're perceived and discovers what's actually left underneath, and why that discovery, however unsettling at first, is the only real doorway to a kind of clarity performance can never produce. Picture someone walking into a room full of people they know well, co-workers, old friends, extended family, and watch, if you can, the almost imperceptible shift that happens in the first 3 seconds. The posture adjusts slightly. The voice lifts half a register. A version of themselves clicks into place, one calibrated precisely for this particular audience, assembled so quickly and so habitually that the person doing it isn't even aware a switch occurred. This isn't dishonesty. It's something both more ordinary and more consequential, a lifetime of social calibration operating exactly as it was trained to. Carl Jung would have recognized this switch instantly, because it sits at the exact center of what he spent decades studying. He called this socially adapted self the persona, and he argued that nearly everyone builds one, refines it, and eventually mistakes it for their actual identity. The persona isn't a lie. It's a survival tool, shaped by every room a person has ever needed to be accepted in. But Jung's warning was specific and unsettling. The longer a person lives inside the persona, without ever stepping outside it, the less they remember there was ever a difference between the performance and themselves. Think about the last time you caught yourself agreeing with something you didn't actually believe, simply because disagreement felt like too much friction for the moment. Or laughing at something that wasn't funny to you, because the room expected laughter, and you'd learned long ago that supplying it was easier than explaining why you didn't feel it. These moments feel too small to matter individually, but multiply them by years, by thousands of rooms, by every relationship calibrated slightly toward what would be well received rather than what was actually true. And something significant has happened without ever announcing itself. An entire life has been built around managing an impression, and the person living it can no longer easily locate where the impression ends and they begin. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable, because performing isn't something certain people do and others don't. It's a universal human capacity, refined early and rewarded constantly, and the people who perform most fluently are often the ones praised the most for it, for being easy, likable, low maintenance. Exactly what a room needs them to be. Watch closely, because this becomes especially visible in the people whose entire reputation is built on how effortlessly they navigate other people. The friend everyone describes as so easy to be around. The colleague who can read a room in seconds and adjust before anyone else even senses tension rising. What looks, from the outside, like natural social gift is very often something else entirely, a lifetime of finely tuned performance, executed so smoothly that even the performer has stopped noticing it's happening. The compliment "you're so easy to talk to" can, underneath, describe someone who has become extraordinarily skilled at disappearing into whatever the conversation needs them to be. Alfred Adler offers the clearest explanation for why this capacity gets built so early and so thoroughly. Adler believed that children develop, almost immediately, a working theory of what earns them belonging within their family and social world. And that theory becomes the blueprint for an entire personality. A child who discovers that being impressive earns attention learns to perform competence. A child who discovers that being agreeable earns peace learns to perform harmony. A child who discovers that being entertaining earns affection learns to perform charm. None of these children are being manipulative. They're doing exactly what any intelligent organism does when it learns which behaviors produce safety and which produce danger. The tragedy isn't that the performance was learned. The tragedy is how rarely anyone ever teaches the child later that the performance was supposed to be temporary. But that isn't the real problem. The real problem is what happens to a person's internal compass after decades of using someone else's approval as the primary instrument for navigation. Something even more dangerous develops beneath years of performing, and it has to do with a phenomenon cognitive psychology has mapped with unsettling precision. When a person consistently prioritizes external reception over internal truth, the brain doesn't merely suppress authentic reactions, it gradually loses practice accessing them at all. This is not a metaphor. The capacity to know what you genuinely think, feel, or want operates like any other cognitive skill. It strengthens with use and atrophies with neglect. A person who has spent decades asking, before almost anything else, how will this be received, has spent that same span of time not asking a much simpler question, what do I actually think about this? Over enough years, the second question doesn't just go unanswered. It becomes genuinely difficult to hear underneath the noise of the first. And this explains something that confuses so many high-functioning, socially successful people the first time they attempt any real self-reflection, why the question, what do you actually want, can produce something close to panic. Most people never notice what comes next, because they interpret that panic as a personal deficiency, evidence that something is wrong with them specifically, rather than what it actually is, the predictable result of a skill that was simply never developed, because it was never needed for survival the way the performance was. Consider what this looks like in an actual moment, because it rarely announces itself as a crisis. It shows up as someone sitting in a therapist's office, or a quiet car, or an empty apartment on a Sunday afternoon. Being asked a simple, ordinary question, what do you want to do with your life? What do you actually enjoy? How do you really feel about this relationship? And experiencing something close to vertigo. Not because the question is difficult in content, but because there's no immediate, reliable internal source to check. The instinct that usually fires first, what would be the right answer here? What would sound good has nowhere to go, because there's no audience to calibrate for. And in that gap, where an authentic answer should be waiting, there is instead an unfamiliar, disorienting quiet. This is the point where neuroscience adds a layer of physiological weight to what's happening. Sustained impression management, the ongoing, largely unconscious labor of monitoring how one is being perceived and adjusting accordingly, has been linked to elevated activity in brain regions associated with vigilance and threat monitoring, the same systems that evolved to track danger in the environment. In other words, performing isn't experienced by the nervous system as neutral. It's experienced as low-grade, continuous alertness, the body treating social evaluation with a version of the same urgency it would treat a genuine threat. This is why performing, even when it looks effortless from the outside, is so quietly depleting from the inside. The body has been on watch the entire time. Something even more dangerous is happening underneath even that, though, because this constant vigilance doesn't just drain energy in the moment. It reshapes what a person believes is even possible for them to feel. Evolutionary psychology explains why this vigilance runs so deep in the first place. For most of human history, social standing within a small group determined access to food, protection, and mates, meaning the ability to accurately track and manage how others perceived you, wasn't a soft skill. It was survival infrastructure. The nervous system inherited from that history treats social approval with a seriousness modern life rarely acknowledges consciously, which is exactly why the fear of being seen honestly, flaws and uncertainty included, can feel disproportionately intense. It isn't disproportionate at all, biologically speaking. It's an ancient alarm system doing precisely what it was built to do, simply firing in a modern context where the actual stakes are almost never what they once were. Watch closely, because there's a second mechanism reinforcing all of this. One behavioral psychology explains with uncomfortable clarity. Every successful performance, every room that responds well, every interaction that goes smoothly, because the right version of the self was deployed at the right moment, gets logged by the brain as a confirmed strategy. Worth repeating. This creates a powerful reinforcement loop that has nothing to do with conscious choice. The performance works, so it continues, and it continues so consistently that stopping it, even briefly, starts to feel less like an option and more like a risk the nervous system has been trained for years to avoid. Which raises the real question underneath this entire documentary. If performing is this exhausting and increasingly disconnecting, why does the idea of stopping feel more frightening than the exhaustion itself? The answer lies in a distinction Viktor Frankl considered essential to psychological freedom. Frankl observed that human beings are capable of extraordinary endurance when their suffering is attached to meaning, and this insight applies with unsettling precision to a lifetime of performing. For most people who perform habitually, the performance isn't meaningless labor, it's the primary mechanism through which they've secured love, belonging, and safety for as long as they can remember. Stopping doesn't just risk an awkward moment. It risks confronting the possibility that the unperformed self might not generate the same response, might not be as well received, might, in the most frightening version of this fear, not be enough on its own terms at all. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable in a different way, because it reveals what's actually being protected by the performance. It was never vanity. It was fear, operating so quietly and for so long that it had disguised itself as personality. The Stoics arrived at a related insight centuries before modern psychology gave it clinical language. Seneca warned that a person who spends their life adjusting themselves to please an audience will eventually lose the ability to recognize their own voice beneath all the adjustment, mistaking the sum of other people's expectations for a personality of their own. Marcus Aurelius, despite governing an empire whose demands for public composure were relentless, treated private, honest self-examination as a non-negotiable discipline. Understanding that a mind never allowed to be simply itself, even briefly, eventually forgets what itself actually is. Epictetus pushed the argument further, insisting that true freedom begins the moment a person stops needing external approval to feel whole, not because approval doesn't matter at all, but because a self built entirely on securing it was never actually free to begin with. Imagine two people receiving identical criticism in a professional setting. One has spent years performing competence so thoroughly that the criticism feels like a direct attack on their entire identity, because in a real sense it is, since the performed self and the actual self were never clearly distinguished. The other has done the slower, less glamorous work of separating who they are from how they're perceived, and experiences the same criticism as useful, uncomfortable information about a specific piece of work, nothing more. The difference between them isn't confidence in the way that word usually gets used. It's the presence or absence of an authentic self, sturdy enough to remain intact regardless of how any particular performance is received. This also explains a phenomenon that confuses people who finally do attempt to stop performing, at least temporarily, why the initial experience so often feels worse before it feels better. Cognitive psychology shows that identity, once built around a specific structure, resists sudden change even when that change is genuinely wanted, because the nervous system interprets any significant shift in behavior as a potential threat to established safety. This is why the first honest opinion voiced after years of agreeable silence can feel disproportionately terrifying, why the first unpolished, unrehearsed version of yourself offered to another person can feel like standing in a room with no clothes on. This discomfort is not evidence that stopping the performance was a mistake. It's evidence that the performance had for a long time been doing exactly the job it was built for, It's worth noticing, too, that the people around a performer often resist the change before the performer fully commits to it themselves. A friend who has only ever known the agreeable, accommodating version of someone may respond to a first honest boundary not with relief, but with confusion, even mild hurt, because the relationship, as it existed, was built around a specific performance, and any deviation from it disrupts an equilibrium that had quietly suited everyone but the person maintaining it. This isn't proof that honesty was the wrong choice. It's simply evidence that some relationships were built on the performance itself, and those relationships were never going to survive its absence intact. That distinction, uncomfortable as it is, turns out to be one of the most useful pieces of information the whole process reveals. There is a quiet kind of relief available once this becomes visible, though, because it reframes an experience many people have spent years quietly ashamed of: the strange loneliness of being constantly surrounded and rarely known, the fatigue that follows even pleasant social gatherings, the unsettling sense of having excelled at being liked while somehow never being fully seen. None of these are signs of social failure. They are the predictable, almost inevitable cost of a life organized around reception rather than truth. And recognizing that cost is often the first real step towards setting it down. None of this means abandoning tact, kindness, or social awareness altogether. Jung never argued for a self stripped of all consideration for others, and neither does any serious psychological framework. The goal was never to become abrasive in the name of honesty. The goal was integration, allowing the socially aware, considerate self to coexist with an honest inner life, instead of allowing the first to fully replace the second. Awareness changes this dynamic more than people expect, and it tends to begin in genuinely small moments rather than dramatic ones, noticing the reflexive urge to agree before actually checking what you think, noticing the automatic smile that arrives before any real feeling has been consulted, noticing the specific physical relief that shows up in an unguarded moment alone, and asking honestly what that relief is relief from. Each of these small noticings is a brief return to a self that was never actually destroyed by the performance, only temporarily obscured by how consistently it was overridden. The next realization changes everything, and it's this: the wisdom that arrives after performing stops isn't loud, triumphant, or immediately comfortable. It tends to be quiet, almost unassuming, a growing capacity to sit with silence instead of filling it, to disagree without needing the disagreement softened into invisibility, to be fully known by a small number of people rather than partially liked by a great many. This wisdom was never available while the performance was running, not because performing is inherently wrong, but because performance and self-knowledge require two entirely different kinds of attention, and a person can only fully occupy one at a time. There's a particular clarity that tends to arrive somewhere in this process, unannounced, usually in an ordinary moment, rather than a significant one, a realization that the people who genuinely matter were never actually won over by the performance in the first place. They were the ones who stayed curious even during the moments the performance faltered, who seemed, if anything, more interested once something unpolished slipped through. This realization tends to land quietly, almost embarrassingly late, and it reorganizes an enormous amount of accumulated fear all at once. The performance was protecting connections that, it turns out, were never actually dependent on it. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this ends. If you stopped adjusting yourself, right now, for every room you walked into, not out of rebellion, but simply to see what remained when the adjusting finally stopped, who do you think would actually be standing there? And is that person someone you've ever really allowed yourself to meet? If this kind of psychology speaks to something in you, consider staying. There's more waiting beneath the performance, and the wisdom on the other side of it might be the truest thing you ever find.